Hello and welcome to this 3D World tutorial in which I'm going to be using some of the new tools in LightWave 11 to make a landscape and cover it with rocks, have rocks scattered around in a nicely random organic fashion. In editions of LightWave previous to this one, you could have done it. You would have to model it and place things by hand. But in LightWave 11 we've got the new instancing function which makes the whole process much simpler. So just to get started, I'm just going to show you how to use some of the other new tools in LightWave 11. Just going to make a rock. Add some geometry to a standard box, just so we've got enough points to be move them around, make it look a nicely kind of random shape. I think that will probably do it. So there's our rock. First thing you have to do is file and save the object. Let's call it rock1. There's one already there. I'll replace it. Now, that's not very rocky. You could sit in Modeler and move all the vertices and polygons by hand, but that's way too time consuming. So what we'll do is move over to this new tab here in LightWave 11, which is the IO tab, and click on Go Z. And now, assuming of course that you have a copy of ZBrush lying around, what will happen is that your object gets transported over to ZBrush as a subtool, or as a tool rather. So you just need to click on the tool, drag it into the scene, hit T to edit, F to zoom in, and then now we have we've got our objects here. We can kind of just go around and start breaking up the angularity of the box itself, getting rid of all the corners and generally making it fairly random. It doesn't really matter what tools you use for this, because it's all you're really doing is moving the points around. We're not actually adding or subtracting any geometry from the shape itself. I just want to make it look nicely organic and random. So excuse me while I just can't multitask. I can't talk and make rocks at the same time. It's still a little bit boxy, isn't it? So we'll just add to make some more kind of jutty out bits. Take some bits back in again, smooth them down. The smooth tool is quite good actually, because it kind of takes all the pointy edges off. Use the Alt button to remove, to move the points inwards rather than outwards, and still looking a bit blocky. Let's try and get some more randomness into the shape. As I say, you can imagine trying to do this level of manipulation with the tools inside LightWave. LightWave is a great modeler, although it hasn't been updated for some time, but this would be a very tedious operation to do this kind of level of work. So I reckon we're pretty much there. There is a rock, sort of. Right, okay, enough of that rock-shaped object. What we do is go over here to the into the Tools tab, and underneath here is another Go Z button. So we hit that, and all being well, ta-da! Back in LightWave, there's our object, nicely randomized. Now, obviously, because this is all quads, you could just hit the Tab key and turn it into a really super smooth subdivision surface. But I think for the purposes of this tutorial and for this scene, it's probably best if we kind of just leave it more or less like that. I think what I'll do is I'll subdivide it a little bit just to kind of get rid of all the flat planes. So that's Shift D to bring up subdivide, and hit smooth, click OK, and there we go. That's kind of actually, let's try the other one. Let's try Metaform. What does Metaform do? No, more or less the same. So yeah, we'll keep it smooth like that. So there you go. You've got not one nice, fairly random rock, which is quite good actually, because one of the things you do want, it'll be rotated around on the landscape so it looks slightly different from all different angles, so that's all good. So we'll save that and close the scene file down. Now obviously if this was your project you'd make a couple of rocks, and it just so happens I think I've got some that I've already prepared, but I'm just going to make one for the time being. Now what we need to do is make the landscape, which is using a very similar kind of technique. Just make a box again. That should be about right, I think. 10 meters, yeah, 100 meters across. And again, need to add plenty of geometry just to give ZBrush something to work with. I'll probably do it. Save the object as ground, and then we go straight back into the IO tab at the top and hit Go Z. Here's our new tool. Now I did this last time and it comes in rather large, so hit, where's my frame button? Good, there we go. There's our object, nicely framed. So again, very similar procedure. You've got a landscape there, and it's just a relatively simple thing to just go in, create kind of dunes and hills. Hit the spacebar in ZBrush to bring up the kind of the cursor controls, and just take the draw size down a little bit, add a little bit more kind of fine detail. And what I kind of wanted to show you was the idea of having, if we have a crater, for instance, in the scene, because then that will give me an excuse to show you one of the tools that we can use in the instancing. We can kind of have a system where we can keep the instances to specific areas. So for instance, in this example, you'd want most of your rocks to kind of sit in the indentations in the low-lying land, and then nothing. You wouldn't want them sat on the hill or on the little dunes and stuff. So there we go. There's a sort of an alien landscape. I don't think it makes that. Yeah, it looks fairly randomised, isn't it? Fairly random, a bit kind of alien-y. Okay, that'll probably do for the purposes of this tutorial. Right, okay, so we hit the Go Z button again. Hopefully, fingers crossed. There we go, back in LightWave. There's our object, nicely deformed. Now, obviously, again with this, because it's all quads, that's not a very smooth landscape. So what we'll do, we'll hit the Tab key, and there you go. You've got a nice smooth landscape. Oops, hold on. With T, I'm just going to move it above the grid plane so you can see it a bit more clearly. That's quite nice. Now then, what we do now is it would be quite difficult to get a height field map from this object, because there's not an awful lot going on, and also I don't really know how to do it, to tell you the truth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a brute force method of just creating surfaces. So if I go to the polygon tab, what I'll do is I'll just hit the Q button, and we'll make this ground. So we'll texture the whole thing first of all. And then what you could do is, or what we will do rather, is just go around and selecting those areas that are largely kind of raised up, certainly around the crater itself, like that. Any kind of hillocks and bits of dune will kind of And although it's quite a kind of, it's a bit of a brute force method because your polygons aren't very big, it'll still be completely fine for the purposes of this little scene that we're doing. Couple there maybe. Call it Q, call it ground high. And so there we go. That's actually, I might just add a bit more just to make sure we've got some clear space between the two. Okay, right, let's do that. Oops, cancel that. There's a few errant polygons over there. Q, ground height. Okay. Now then, save that object again. Right. What we can do is we can now send that object over to layout. Ta-da! One landscape in layout. Now, what you need to do to make instancing work, you need all the objects that you're going to instance in the scene. So, I'm actually going to cheat a bit. I've actually got some. I've got some rocks I've already prepared. So rock 1, rock 2, rock 3, and rock 4. And these are all made in a very similar fashion to the other one. I think I started with a block or a sphere and a capsule just to make sure they're all kind of nicely random. And they're all lurking there. You can see them. Underneath the landscape. Doesn't really matter. You're not gonna, it doesn't matter whether you can see them or not. You can just grab them off the edge of the scene. What you need to do now, Shift O to select objects. I need to select my ground object there. Go to the Properties tab. Whoa, massive Properties tab. That's the joy of grabbing on a tiny screen, or rather a tiny screen area. Now what we do in here, you can see at the end it's got an instance. Instancer. So we're going to add an instance generator. Double click on it, and there's your instance generator. Now sometimes this doesn't come in properly, sometimes the left hand panel is missing, so you might just kind of just pull the corner just to make sure you can see it all. And we'll add an object. Obviously we'll add rock 1, rock 2, rock 3 and rock 4. So they've all been added to the scene. Now over here, if you go to polygons, increase the instances, obviously beyond 1, at 100, you can see there that we've got the landscape, we've got 4 different types of rock, blue, green, teal and red, and they've been scattered nicely across the surface. Now it's linked to, I put it the type, the pull down menu, as polygons, so they're actually kind of attached to individual polygons on the surface of the landscape. So that's all looking pretty good. Now then, just to prove it actually works, we'll click it on and go into VPR mode, which is the real-time renderer. And there you can see my my pre-made and pre-textured rocks clinging to the surface. Now that's great, but it looks slightly like a Dalmatian kind of landscape. The rocks need to be a bit bigger. Now obviously if you'd made this by hand, you'd have to go, oh good grief, all my rocks are too small, I'm going to have to go back in, scale them up and put them back into the scene. Not so in this instance. Again, what you can do, you can, in the tabs across the bottom, give you loads of controls. So in scale, you can go, well obviously you'd rather have them random, because this is a much more organic kind of scene than something that's, you know, maybe with chairs or you know, physical man-made objects. So random, so we'll have them up to 20% smaller and then up to 200% bigger. There you go. Already that's starting to look a little bit more useful. And we can crank the instances up. Let's have 500 instances. There we go. And this is a really good thing about LightWave's system with the new VPR. You can just, I mean, you can see it really well in OpenGL mode with just bounding boxes, which is really good. But VPR just gives you that snapshot. You can look at the scene, make sure it looks right. Right, okay, so that's all very neat and tidy. We've got 4 different rocks, and they're all pointing in the same direction, and they're all the same distance above the ground. So one of the things we can do is go in, we can add more randomness. So we can have, let's just have a maximum of, I can add a little bit of stretching. Oops. So immediately you get much more of variable shapes in the rocks. The offset, you can have them, obviously we want them really in the Y direction, see what you want. Some of them to be sat on the ground, some of them to be buried in the sand or whatever. So you can have a negative value and a positive value. Now how's that working? That's not looking too bad. And obviously in rotation is ideal for rocks because they're all nicely kind of random themselves. By the time you add a rotation, they will all look very different. They won't all be pointing in the right direction. They'll all be different parts of them will be out of the ground at the same time. So let's just have a check in VPR, see how that's looking. And as you can see, that's looking pretty good. But again, they are kind of all over the place. Now, let's aim for, if we're aiming for a sort of Martian landscape, we could do with some of them being some not necessarily kind of resting on the hills. Now, because we delineated a surface, what we can do the instancing by surface, and then on the surface name, if we do ground instead of ground high, they will then only be on. Actually, I've got to check. Yeah, they will only be replicated on the lower part of the landscape. Any bits that I mean, occasionally there's one or two that kind of sneak in, just because the way we've created the surface, because it's only, you know, it's limited by polygons. But largely, you'll notice that the top of the crater and the top of the hills don't have any rocks on them at all. Now, as I mentioned before, you can do this. You could easily do this with if you've got a big landscape, maybe it's a landscape garden or something, you could probably do this with a height field map. You can draw a map yourself, you could generate one. And then what you can do in each of the individual rocks, the weighting is the probability of the rock appearing in the particular area. But what you can do now, so obviously for rock 1, if we go back to the texture shaded view, if I click on rock 4, which is the red rock, and then just make the weight 10%, you see that they pretty much disappear. There's almost, because there's 3 other rocks at 100% probability of appearing, the red rock kind of hardly does at all. If you kind of change them all to 50%, what you will get is you'll get equal amounts of all the rocks, but there's only a 50% chance of them appearing, so you don't get as many overall as if they were all at 100%. So let's just make them 100. But there you go. So they've all got 100% of appearing, but they're all delineated over here by the ground surface that we set up in Modeler. With all of these, again, you can set them by different values. You can have the weighting on here. You can have them by an envelope, or you can do them by a texture. So obviously, if you went in here, you could add a grayscale image to delineate where the instances would or wouldn't appear. But in this case, I think it's just a very simple thing to go in, select a surface, And the good thing is, of course, I can go back into Modeler. If I bring up my statistics panel and show the surfaces, if I go show ground high, for example, I can really easily go in and go, well, you know, that they are kind of coming onto this surface. So let's just extend this all the way around. Let's try and keep them down in the low parts as much as possible. I'm going to give my crater a bit more room. So as you can see, I mean, in terms of going in, producing another height field map, whether that's in Photoshop or whether it's going and kind of rendering one out or something, this is just much faster. So save that. I shall synchronize with layout, and hopefully, I'm not sure that's done anything. Hold on a second. Okay. Hopefully that has had an effect. There we go. That's better. Sorry, you can see the effect because I've actually selected ground high, which is the area, that's the surface that we don't want them onto. So click on ground instead and get rid of ground high, and there we go. So now we've got them all. I don't quite know what these guys are doing up there. They shouldn't be there, but by and large, I think what happens is there's a degree of creeping over the edge of the surface because of the polygons that they're attached to. But by and large, also the bounding boxes are quite large. It should look pretty good. Yeah, you can see there that ridge there that doesn't have anything on it. Largely, the peak of the crater doesn't have anything on it. So there you go. That's how to scatter rocks across a landscape and have them generally not appearing where you don't want them to. The only thing we need to finish off really is obviously you'd have add a texture to the landscape, and maybe I think probably what it needs is one or two really big boulders that you could place by hand. But the good thing about this system is that somebody comes along and they say, well, I really like it, I like the rocks and everything, but there's too few of them, or there's too many. It's just a simple thing to go in. You can change the scale, so get some bigger rocks. You can change the offset so that a lot more of them are kind of buried underneath the ground or above it, like that. And of course you can just go in and you can change the different ways of having the rotation and scale, and you can pretty much get it the way you want it. And of course this is kind of outside the scope of this tutorial, but you do also have the node-based system which you can use to delineate where the instances are going to go, and you can also use a node-based system for giving them all individual textures. In this instance, I've just got all the four rocks have just got very quite similar but sort of largely different textures. So, but it's just enough to add a bit of variety to the scene. And what I'll do is I'll just cheat slightly. I'll take the surface from rock 1 and paste it onto my landscape, just so you can see the whole thing working. And just make that, I'm going to make that just a little bit lighter and a bit redder. Oops, keep forgetting two surfaces. Copy and paste. And there we go, there's a kind of not completely unrealistic Martian landscape in the making. You can see where, you know, some little bit more detail, bump map, maybe a little bit more sculpting in ZBrush, and you're kind of there or thereabouts. And the good thing is somebody goes, yeah, I love that scene, but I hate the rocks. Okay, rocks gone. So there you go. That's how to use GoZ and the instance generator in LightWave 11. There was one more feature I wanted to talk about that I neglected to in the previous video. If you look at this scene that I used for the illustration in the magazine, we've got a similar setup with a landscape that I've made in ZBrush. I'll open the properties panel and bring up the instancer and add an instance generator. It's got nothing attached so far, but I have already I've preloaded some rocks into the scene. We'll add just a couple of rocks. I'm going to allocate them to a surface as we did before, and we'll do ground low, which is the low-lying land again, and we'll crank up the instances, and there they appear as normal. Now that's fine. Very quickly, just go in. I'm just going to add some variation and some randomness. Hit VPR, and as expected, all the rocks scattered nicely random on the surface. That's great. But if you look in the at the instancing system, they're all allocated to the same surface. If I change the surface to create an edge, for example, and get rid of ground low, all of the rocks are on the edge of the crater, but that's all of them, all three of them. So what happens if I want a particular object in a specific place? Well, let's just move those back to ground low. The answer is actually relatively simple, but not necessarily obvious if you don't know it. You go back to the object, which is the ground plane, and you simply add a second instance generator. Now in this case, I have another object, and again I'm going to allocate it to another surface. Again, it's one of the same surfaces on the ground plane object. I'll put it on the crater edge, and we'll crank up the instances and see what happens. And sure enough, there we go. We now have some space mushrooms on the same, being instanced on the same object at the same time. And the truth is, you could go through and you could do a completely different thing. If you wanted to have a second object or a third object with a different texture, all you have to do is go to the same properties panel in the main object that the instances are supported on. Bring up another instance generator and allocate them to a specific surface. And again, as I mentioned earlier in the other video, you can also do the same thing with texture maps that delineate where the objects appear. That's just a grayscale map that you can generate in Photoshop, or you can have rendered from an object. So that's basically it. Okay, well, I couldn't really leave this Q&A tutorial without talking briefly about LightWave's node system that you can use to allocate a range of colours across the instances in your scene. Going back to this original scene, I've got just the ground mesh layer and one single rock that is being instanced. As you can see, there's a single instance generator, one rock, weighted at 100% with 1,000 instances, so basically there are 1,000 rocks on the surface. However, if you look at the surface editor, you'll see that they all have the same surface, which is rock 1, brown, bit of texture mapping, bit of bump mapping, basically not very much going on. We'd like to add some variety to this scene, make it a little bit more natural. So go up into the Edit Nodes part, click Edit Nodes, and then open up the Node Editor. And there are two basic ways to do this, but first of all we need to add some nodes. We'll need an instance info node. So there you go. And then we'll need a gradient. The gradient takes information from the individual instances and then pumps that to the surface. So each instance gets its own variation of the color scheme that you put in. The first way to do it is to just use a standard fixed random, which basically produces a random number allocated to an instance, and it takes the surface from that. So we'll just plug the fixed random into the input, colour into colour. Double click the gradient and bring up the gradient tab. Very simple. Yeah, it's a fairly standard LightWave gradient. Here you can see it's not really much of a gradient at all, it's more of a solid black panel. So we'll click him to make another knot. Click the colour picker, make it white, close it down, and you can see that very quickly, you've got a range of colours from pure black to pure white across all of the instances in the scene, which is pretty much what we want. It's a simple matter to just go in, click on the colour nuts, change them to something a little bit more suitable. Take some colours from the scene maybe, and then I'll make this a nice dark colour, so we've got some variety. And maybe make this one a bit brighter. So then let VPR do its thing, and you can see that very simply you've got, not only do you have a nice kind of organic random look of the rocks, but they all have slightly different shades to them as well, which is which can go to make the scene look much more naturalistic. Now there is also another way of doing that, because what you will have here, you will have a range of colours. If we change them to something a little bit more garish, so let's go from blue to yellow, you see that obviously you've got some that are pure blue, some that are this kind of acid lemon yellow, but you get quite a few in the middle. They'll take their colours from the entire range. Now if you've got a man-made scene, for instance, maybe there's cards in a car park or bottles on a shelf, and you want them to be set up maybe like an aisle in a supermarket, you'd want specific colours for different products. You don't really want this, this range going on. So what we'll do, let's go back into the node editor, and we'll change it to ID index. That will take, or rather that will provide an individual ID for each instance. So you'll have instance 001, 002, right up to 1000. So at the moment, you go back to the gradient, and you kind of go, well, okay, well, I've set up the individual IDs. Why are they all yellow? Well, the problem is that you'll see here its start is at 0 and the end is at 1. And at the moment, the only actual colour you've got is integer 1. So that's just that colour there. It's just the acid lemon yellow that's being allocated to all of the instances. What we actually need to do is change that to 1 and change that to 1000. And then when you add in another knot here, I'll change that to something equally horrible. Now it works. You've got the very first value being at 1, then you've got 999 shades all the way through, down to the final one at 1000, right at the bottom. So you've got a wide range of colours across your instances. But again, you've got some here that are pink, peachy pink colour. Now you may not want that, so what you need to do is go in, let's just add some different colours. Blue, maybe a nice vivid green. As you can see, I've completely lost all plot of photoreality in this scene, but we may change it to a pale blue. So you've got a range of instances taking all the colours from this gradient, but again you will have in between colours. So the simple thing to do is to go to each individual knot in the gradient and change the smoothing from Hermite down to step. And what this means is that, well, as you can see on the gradient, it basically means that there isn't any smoothing between the knots in the gradient. They're all stepped, so there's just discrete colours between each one. So obviously now, I'll just move this up a little bit. The only colours you will have in your instances are the ones actually represented on the gradient. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 colours, and 5 colours here. So there you go. That's how to use LightWave's nodal system to colour your instances.